The village of St Mary Mead basked in the late summer sun, its cottages huddled around the green as if whispering secrets to one another. Birdsong floated lazily over the neatly trimmed hedges, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of elderflowers from the hedgerows. Yet for all the serenity, a certain tautness lingered, an unspoken tension in the air that Miss Jane Marple, perched quietly in the corner of the village hall, noticed immediately. It was the annual harvest tea, a tradition that brought together the whole village. The long tables groaned under silver teapots, fine bone china, and an array of cakes, plum, currant, and a particularly dark, rich elderberry concoction that Mrs. Pennington had baked herself. Miss Marple, her knitting resting untouched on her lap, surveyed the gathering with an almost imperceptible lift of her spectacles. The first to draw her attention was Mrs. Henshaw, bustling about with a tray of scones, her smile just a touch too tight. Every so often she would glance toward Mr. Cartwright, the vicar, who stood in quiet conversation with Miss Evelyn Pritchard, a newcomer with a pale, deliberate politeness that suggested she weighed every word before it left her lips. Miss Marple's fingers twitched lightly over her knitting, a habit she reserved for moments of quiet observation. Across the hall the children played near the hearth, their laughter bright but nervously edged, as though aware of the grown-ups' veiled scrutiny. Mrs. Pennington, proud of her elderberry wine cake, arranged it ceremoniously in the centre of her table. She looked around as if expecting universal admiration, her eyes flicking toward Mr. Thackeray, a distant cousin who had returned from London after a sudden, unexplained absence. He raised an eyebrow at her offering, but said nothing, his hands tucked behind him, fingers brushing against the polished wood of the chair. Miss Marple noted the undercurrents, the flickers of irritation, the half-smiles that didn't quite reach the eyes. Even in this simple, convivial setting, there were grudges, alliances, and histories hidden beneath the polite conversation. It was these invisible threads, more than any obvious quarrel, that often signalled trouble. "Delightful day, isn't it?" Mrs. Henshaw said, approaching Miss Marple with a cup of tea. The words were airy, light, but Miss Marple caught the slight tremor in her hand as she set it down. "You'll have a slice of Mrs. Pennington's elderberry cake, of course?" Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Thank you, my dear. I shall enjoy it very much." Her eyes, however, never left the table. She noted the cake's edges, too perfectly baked, too symmetrical, as if every detail had been obsessively monitored. Small things, subtle things, spoke volumes if one knew how to look. The vicar's conversation with Miss Pritchard drew her attention next. "The garden looks particularly fine this year," he was saying. Miss Pritchard nodded, her posture erect, her hands clasped delicately in front of her. Yet her eyes darted occasionally to the elderberry cake. Miss Marple filed the observation away, an innocent glance, perhaps, or curiosity tinged with something else. Then there was the matter of Mr. Thackeray. He lingered near the doorway, watching the room with a slight frown. His eyes were dark and discerning, as if measuring the villagers' every move against some private scale. Miss Marple did not know him well, but she had learned in her years that those who returned unexpectedly from the city often carried stories they were reluctant to share, stories that sometimes left bitterness in their wake. The tea party continued with polite chatter and laughter, yet Miss Marple's attention flicked to minor inconsistencies. Mrs. Henshaw seemed to avoid the vicar's gaze. Miss Pritchard's compliments were carefully measured. Mr. Thackeray's hands itched toward the cake, yet he held back. These tiny gestures, almost imperceptible to others, were the threads Miss Marple would follow if trouble arrived. It was only natural then that it did. The first sound was almost a whisper. But it drew every eye, a sharp cough from the far end of the hall, then a muffled cry. The children froze mid-laugh, and the adults turned as one. Mrs. Pennington's elderberry cake sat untouched, save for a single slice now missing. At the table's centre, Mr. Thackeray staggered slightly, his face pale, a cup of tea tipping from his fingers. The silence stretched taut until he collapsed into the nearest chair, clutching his throat. Chaos erupted. Mrs. Henshaw rushed forward, her hands shaking as she attempted to support him. The vicar knelt beside him, murmuring calm reassurances that only partially masked his alarm. Miss Pritchard froze, eyes wide, her composure failing for the first time. And Miss Marple? She remained seated, her gaze unflinching, her mind noting everything, The angle of his fall, the faint stain of tea on the napkin, the absence of any other spillage. "Poison!" someone whispered, almost as a curse. The word hung in the air, though no one dared speak it too loudly. Miss Marple, however, allowed the word to drift past her, choosing instead to observe. Panic clouded the villagers' reactions, but it was the subtle signs, the coughs, the glances, the hesitation, that spoke louder than the outcry. By the time the local constable arrived, summoned by the vicar's swift intervention, the scene had settled into a tense order. Mr. Thackeray sat upright, pale but conscious, his fingers trembling around a glass of water the vicar had pressed into his hand. The villagers, though curious and frightened, retreated to whispers and pointed glances. Miss Marple's eyes met no one's directly. Instead, they traced patterns in the room, the way the light fell across the polished wood, the slight smudge on a teacup, the imperceptible twitch of a lace cuff. Something was amiss, undeniably so, yet Miss Marple waited. Observation first, conclusions later. She had learned that panic often obscured truth, and that the smallest detail, easily overlooked, might reveal the answer in time. As the sun dipped lower, casting elongated shadows across the green, the villagers began to drift toward home, murmuring conjectures and excuses. Miss Marple remained behind for a moment, her knitting forgotten, eyes fixed on the elderberry cake, now half sliced. The ordinary gathering had ended, but the ripple of unease promised that the villagers' quiet life would be anything but peaceful in the days to come. The next morning, Mary Mead woke to a quiet that felt less serene and more cautious. The sun shone with the same gentle warmth, but in the village square conversations were hushed and glances wary. News of Mr. Thackeray's collapse had spread swiftly, carried from one doorstep to another, growing in colour and drama with every retelling. At Miss Marple's cottage, the detective sipped her morning tea while glancing through the lace curtains at the street beyond. Villagers passed by in small, hesitant clusters, their murmurs drifting faintly on the breeze. Each snippet of gossip was a clue in its own right. It must have been the cake. I saw Mrs. Henshaw hovering near him. Perhaps Mr. Thackeray is exaggerating? Miss Marple set her cup down gently, her fingers tracing the edge. Words, tone, and hesitation often revealed more than outright statements. She was not alone in observing. Mrs. Henshaw, recovering from her earlier panic, fussed about the vicarage garden, her composure brittle. Miss Pritchard, meanwhile, had been invited for tea at the vicarage, ostensibly to discuss community matters, though her pale features hinted at a lingering unease, and Mrs. Pennington. She moved from house to house, making rounds, seeking reassurance about her cake, while managing to sow a trace of anxiety wherever she went. Miss Marple noted these motions with quiet interest. Each villager's behaviour, whether avoidance, overcompensation, or defensive chatter, was a thread she intended to follow. The village hall remained cordoned off for the day, though Constable Peters had allowed only minimal interference. He kept an eye on the evidence, the half-sliced elderberry cake, the teacup, and the table where Mr. Thackeray had faltered. Yet Miss Marple knew that the puzzle lay less in utensils and more in human behaviour. People's reactions were never neutral. Panic, guilt, or hidden satisfaction often manifested subtly. By mid-morning, a group had gathered at the green, discussing the incident in a mixture of fear and curiosity. Mrs. Henshaw's voice was higher than usual as she recounted her version of events. I was only trying to help. I didn't—" she faltered, clutching a handkerchief. Miss Marple observed the slight tremor in her hands and the way she avoided looking directly at Mr. Thackeray when he passed. Small hesitations like these were rarely meaningless. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Miss Pritchard, who lingered at the edge of the crowd, hands folded tightly in front of her. "I still find it hard to believe it was intentional," she said softly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of something sharper. Calculation, perhaps, or anxiety about being observed. Miss Marple filed the detail away, noting how some of the villagers were quick to assume misfortune, while others weighed every interaction with careful scrutiny. Meanwhile, Mr. Thackeray, pale but upright, walked slowly with the vicar, Mr. Cartwright, toward the churchyard. Villagers fell silent as he passed. He carried himself differently than the day before, measured, tense, and aware of every gaze. Miss Marple, watching from a discreet distance, noticed the subtle stiffening in his shoulders whenever someone mentioned the cake. It was natural enough, who wouldn't flinch after a near poisoning? but she made a mental note of the patterns in his behaviour. Gossip circulated quickly. Some believed it had been an accident, perhaps a misstep in Mrs. Pennington's baking, while others hinted at darker motives. "I wouldn't be surprised if there was a grudge," muttered old Mr. Finch, leaning on his cane. "One never knows with city folk returning from London." His words, casual as they were, triggered a ripple of speculation about Mr. Thackeray's past, and whether someone might have wished him harm. Later in the morning, Miss Marple visited the village shop, ostensibly to buy flour for her own baking, but also to observe interactions first-hand. Mrs. Henshaw arrived shortly after, ostensibly for supplies, but her nervous glances betrayed her preoccupation with the previous day's events. "I just don't understand it," she murmured, reaching for a sack of sugar with hands that shook only slightly. Miss Marple offered a polite nod, saying nothing, letting the nervous words hang between them. Observation required patience, after all. The subtle threads of social tension revealed themselves more clearly during lunch at the Queen's Arms Inn. Villagers gathered under the low beams, cups of tea in hand, speaking in low voices. Miss Pritchard seated herself strategically, near the window but facing the room, a posture that suggested both vigilance and control. Mrs. Pennington joined the table, insisting that no one should be worried about her cake. It was entirely her responsibility, she said, with a faint edge to her tone that hinted at defensiveness. Miss Marple listened quietly as villagers disclosed fragments of yesterday's incident. No one told the full story. Some emphasised the suddenness of Mr. Thackeray's collapse. Others dwelled on who had helped him first. Contradictions abounded, but to Miss Marple each discrepancy was a clue, a hesitation, a slip of phrasing, a glance that lingered too long. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, carrying only a small bundle of groceries. The village, despite its familiar charm, felt different now. Every smile and greeting carried the weight of suspicion, yet no one acknowledged it outright. Miss Marple sipped her tea, eyes drifting to the small ledger she kept of her observations, where she began recording the seemingly inconsequential details. Who touched the cake? Who had avoided eye contact? Who seemed unusually interested in Mr. Thackeray's recovery? The afternoon waned, and shadows lengthened across the green. As the villagers dispersed to their homes, Miss Marple sat by her window, in knitting idle stitches but watching everything. The initial shock had settled, yet unease persisted. Something about the incident did not fit neatly into the framework of accident or misfortune, and though no one else noticed, a faint detail caught her eye. A small smudge on the vicar's teacup, half hidden beneath the tablecloth, too faint to attract attention to anyone else, yet too deliberate to ignore. It was a minor imperfection, but in Miss Marple's experience, minor imperfections often concealed major truths. The stage was set. The village had reacted, tensions simmered beneath the polite facades, and hidden motives waited quietly to surface. Miss Marple, patient as always, would watch and wait. In time, the threads of human behaviour, fear, guilt, resentment, and calculation would unravel the mystery entirely. The morning air carried a crisp chill, signalling the end of summer and the approach of autumn. Miss Marple walked slowly along the cobbled streets of St. Mary Mead, her eyes scanning the familiar facades as though seeing them anew. After the chaos of the harvest tea, the village had become a theatre of small gestures and uneasy glances. Even in routine conversations, tensions lurked beneath civility. The local constable, Peters, had already begun questioning villagers, though his approach was methodical rather than probing. He spoke with each person in turn, recording statements with careful hand, yet he seemed to overlook the subtleties that Miss Marple found so revealing. She observed from a distance, letting words and gestures settle like dust before she weighed them. Her first stop was Mrs. Henshaw, seated stiffly in her parlour, on her hands folded over a cup of tea. Her eyes flickered toward the window every few seconds, as if expecting someone or something to appear. "It was all so sudden," she murmured when Miss Marple entered. I did everything I could, but I—" She broke off, pressing a handkerchief to her lips. Miss Marple inclined her head, keeping her response neutral. "You acted as quickly as you could," she said softly. "Tell me, what did you notice first?" Mrs. Henshaw hesitated. Her gaze fell to the floor before returning to Miss Marple. His hands, they trembled, and then he coughed. Just once, and then everything happened so fast. Her lips pressed together. Miss Marple noted the subtle avoidance of certain details, a pause too long before mentioning who had offered assistance, who had approached the table first. Next, Miss Marple visited Mrs. M. Pennington at her cottage. The baker had insisted that her cake had been handled carefully, that she had followed her usual recipe to the letter. "I don't understand," she said, wringing her hands. "It's simply elderberry wine cake, no more, no less. I've baked it this way for 20 years. Yet when she moved to show the slice she had reserved, her hand hesitated, the knife hovering, as if remembering yesterday's abrupt collapse. Small acts of nervous repetition often accompanied guilt or knowledge. Later she observed Miss Evelyn Pritchard pacing the vicarage garden. Her movements were precise, deliberate, and Miss Marple recognised the tension in the alignment of her shoulders. "I keep thinking," Miss Pritchard said, almost to herself, "what if someone truly wanted to harm him? To make it appear accidental?" Her eyes flicked toward the sky as if weighing the thought, then returned to the garden path where the gravel had been pressed unevenly. Miss Marple filed the observation mentally. Cautious phrasing, careful gaze, attention to detail, nothing reckless. Meanwhile, Mr. Thackeray had begun recounting his experience to the vicar, his voice calm but tight. "I felt something strange in the tea, too bitter, yet not enough to recognise immediately. And then a cough, and I knew something was wrong." He paused, glancing toward Miss Marple as she approached. "But I cannot imagine who would wish me ill." His composure seemed steady, but Miss Marple noticed a subtle stiffness in his fingers as he gestured, a trace of unease he tried to mask. The villagers' statements, though individually incomplete, formed a delicate lattice of observation. Miss Marple listened, nodded politely, and allowed others' impressions to surface without interjection. To an outsider, nothing seemed amiss. Yet she noticed contradictions. Mrs. Henshaw claimed to have seen the collapse first, while others insisted they had arrived moments before. The children recalled different sequences, their innocent perspectives oddly precise in detail, but inaccurate in timing. By mid-morning, the constable had begun inspecting the hall again. Miss Marple accompanied him, her presence unassuming, yet every motion and glance was deliberate. The hall smelled faintly of tea, sugar, and wax polish. The table remained largely as it had been the day before, save for the now removed chairs of those who had assisted Mr. Thackeray. She ran her finger lightly over the polished edge, noting a faint smear near where the cup had rested. Imperceptible to anyone else, it suggested movement or contact beyond the obvious. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the silver teapot, resting slightly askew on its tray. Not enough to suggest mishandling, yet deliberate in its displacement. Perhaps nothing, or perhaps the first trace of a deliberate act. She would not know immediately, but she filed it away, the memory serving as a seed for later understanding. Later, at the Queen's Arms, she overheard fragments of conversation among villagers sharing their impressions. "I told you something wasn't right with that cake," said Mrs. Finch, sipping tea. "You saw how Mr. Thackeray coughed?" Another whispered, "Perhaps he's exaggerating. Perhaps it was the wine in the cake." Miss Marple noted the defensive postures, the avoidance of eye contact, the slight hesitation before mentioning certain names. Every gesture, every pause, every smile too quick or too tight contributed to the map of human behaviour she was quietly constructing. Returning home, Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair, knitting forgotten in her lap. Her gaze travelled from the window to the ledger she kept for observations. Patterns emerged, nervous gestures, conflicting accounts, and subtle tension over matters that seemed trivial. Who had sliced the cake first? Who touched which teacup? The fleeting glance of approval or worry. Her mind traced the web connecting each villager. Mrs. Henshaw's over-politeness, Mrs. Pennington's defensiveness, Miss Pritchard's vigilance, Mr. Thackeray's composure. It was all part of a puzzle. And Miss Marple's role was to see the picture they collectively obscured. And beneath it all, she sensed one detail that had not yet emerged fully. Someone had watched, waited, and acted. Perhaps not recklessly, but with a calculated understanding of human expectation. The faint smear on the teacup, the hesitation in a glance, the lingering attention to the elderberry cake, all were threads that, in time, would lead to the unravelling of truth. The early investigation had begun, but Miss Marple understood that observation was patience. Facts, behaviour, and contradictions were far more revealing than any rushed confession. The first glimpses of truth were subtle, invisible to those who expected drama, but to her they were unmistakable. As the village settled again into a wary routine, and Miss Marple prepared herself for the next layer, the subtle probing of suspects, the quiet accumulation of facts, and the gentle uncovering of what villagers preferred to keep hidden. The day's events had offered pieces. The picture was still incomplete, but she felt its edges. Tomorrow, she knew, would bring further revelations, and the beginning of the subtle unravelling that only she could navigate. The morning sun fell obliquely through the curtains of Miss Marple's cottage, spilling golden light onto her neatly kept table. She sipped her tea slowly, letting the warmth seep into her hands, though her thoughts were already racing along the hidden pathways of St. Mary Mead's social intricacies. Yesterday's incident with Mr. Thackeray had left the village unsettled. And Miss Marple knew that unease often fostered the quick assignment of blame. It did not take long for villagers to assemble around the hall, eager to offer their own interpretations. The whispers began almost immediately. Mrs. Pennington's baking, Mrs. Henshaw's nervous ministrations, even Mr. Thackeray himself. In a small village like this, suspicion spreads as quickly as gossip, and everyone has an opinion. Miss Marple attended the gathering at the hall, more observer than participant. Her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, noted every glance, every posture, every twitch of the hand. She had long learned that guilt often spoke through silence and hesitation, and that innocence could be betrayed by the smallest of tells. The first to be considered was naturally Mrs. Pennington. Her elderberry cake had been the scene of the incident. "I swear it was exactly as I always make it," she declared, hands raised slightly as if warding off accusation. Yet Miss Marple saw how her fingers lingered on the edge of the table, brushing the cloth too quickly, a subtle sign of nervous energy. While some villagers nodded in her defence, others exchanged furtive glances, perhaps an accident, perhaps a misstep, but enough to seed doubt. Then there was Mrs. Henshaw, whose overzealous attempts to help Mr. Thackeray had drawn attention. "I only wanted to ensure he was safe," she insisted, her voice quivering despite the firmness of her words. A casual observer might have seen mere concern. Miss Marple noticed the repeated smoothing of her skirt, the way her gaze flicked toward the teacups and the cake as though weighing hidden details. Nervousness alone was not proof, but it often accompanies concealment. A newcomer to suspicion was Miss Pritchard, whose quiet composure now appeared almost rehearsed under the weight of scrutiny. She spoke little, offering measured observations to the vicar and constable, yet her eyes were constantly alert, following every motion in the room. Miss Marple made no note yet of any guilt, only of an acute awareness, an intelligence poised like a hunter. Such precision was admirable, but in a murder investigation it could be misread as calculation. Even Mr. Thackeray himself became, unintentionally, a figure of suspicion in the eyes of some villagers. His calm account of the near poisoning, his careful recounting of the taste in the tea, and the faint tightness in his fingers suggested, to a mind less discerning than Miss Marple's, that perhaps the incident had been exaggerated. Miss Marple, however, observed him closely and found the details consistent, the tremors subtle, yet credible. The constable, flustered by the conflicting testimonies, leaned on the edge of the table. "We must consider all possibilities," he said, though his eyes repeatedly returned to Mrs. Pennington. He had the practical mind of a policeman who sought a straightforward culprit, an answer that could be verified and arrested. Villagers whispered in agreement. The baker had motive, opportunity, and proximity, the perfect target for suspicion. Miss Marple, meanwhile, made mental notes of the tiny inconsistencies everyone else overlooked. Mrs. Henshaw claimed to have been beside Mr. Thackeray at the moment he collapsed, yet her hands showed no signs of flour, sugar, or even tea stains. Miss Pritchard spoke carefully, but her gestures occasionally betrayed impatience. A finger tapping lightly against a chair, a foot shifting just slightly, subtle signs of distraction, or perhaps thoughtfulness. Mr. Thackeray recounted his experience with precision, but the angle of his hands and the occasional flick of his eyes toward the teapot suggested more than mere recollection. By midday, the villagers had formed their informal conclusions, murmuring among themselves and sharing theories. "It must have been an accident," said one. "Or perhaps a slip of the hand," said another. "No, "I saw her near him first," someone else insisted. The collective anxiety was palpable, yet Miss Marple saw beyond the surface, the ease with which people assign blame, the reliance on familiarity rather than facts, and the subtle avoidance of uncomfortable truths. At the vicarage, Miss Marple joined Mr. Cartwright for a quiet discussion. "The villagers will seek someone to blame quickly," she said softly, eyes tracing the gentle sway of the garden hedges. "It is easier than considering that misfortune can be deliberate." The vicar nodded, his expression heavy with concern. "I fear the scandal will unsettle the village further. But you, Miss Marple, seem to see more than most." "Observation, not assumption," she replied. "One must look at what is said, but also at what is left unsaid. Actions, hesitations, the very manner in which people position themselves, these are the things that reveal truth." A few hours later, Miss Marple visited the hall once more. Tracing her fingers lightly over the table edge and inspecting the placement of teacups and plates. Nothing seemed overtly amiss, yet the faint smudge she had noticed before drew her attention again. It was subtle, a slight streak near the cup where Mr. Thackeray had sat, possibly from hurried movement or accidental contact. Miss Marple would not know its significance yet, but she sensed it was part of the emerging pattern. Evening brought a gathering of the village committee, ostensibly to plan the upcoming autumn festival. The discussion was lively, yet beneath the civic facade lay undercurrents of suspicion and unease. Mrs. Henshaw spoke more than usual, almost too eagerly, while Mrs. Pennington remained polite but tense, guarding her composure. Miss Pritchard's comments were precise and deliberate, yet her eyes scanned the room continuously, noting small gestures and exchanges that others overlooked. Miss Marple, seated quietly at the edge of the table, allowed the conversation to flow naturally. Each phrase, each inflection, each glance contributed to a tapestry of behaviour. To the casual observer, the meeting seemed ordinary, but Miss Marple was already connecting threads. Who had access to the cake? Who lingered near Mr. Thackeray? Who seemed unduly attentive to minor details? By the time she returned home, the hallways of St. Mary Mead felt charged with anticipation. The first suspects had emerged, plausible and convincing in their potential guilt. Red herrings were in motion, distractions weaving themselves into the villagers' consciousness, and yet Miss Marple remained patient. Observation, she knew, or would eventually untangle even the most carefully constructed illusion. The village, polite and anxious, had assigned blame quickly, yet Miss Marple's mind worked quietly, noting contradictions, hesitations, and small, telling gestures. The first suspects were obvious, but she suspected that the truth lay elsewhere, hidden among subtleties invisible to everyone else. The next morning brought a gentle mist over St. Mary Mead, softening the edges of cottages and hedgerows. Miss Marple stepped out for her customary early walk, knitting bag swinging lightly at her side, eyes alert to even the smallest irregularities. After the incident with Mr. Thackeray, the village seemed quieter, almost wary of its own steps. Conversations paused when she passed, and shutters were raised just a fraction slower than usual, as though the villagers sensed her watchful scrutiny. Her first stop was the village hall, now cleared for the day and inspected by Constable Peters. Miss Marple traced the path of the tea trolley, noting the precise alignment of cups and saucers, the faint smudge at the corner of the table she had seen before. But it was a tiny scrap of paper that caught her attention, a folded corner wedged beneath the base of a teacup as if placed there unintentionally. Bending slightly, Miss Marple retrieved it carefully. It was a fragment of a note, partially obscured and smeared, with faint ink scrawled across its surface. To anyone else, it might have appeared meaningless, a trivial piece of a shopping list or a forgotten scribble. But to her, the tilt of the handwriting, the selection of words, and the precise fold suggested deliberate concealment. She pocketed it discreetly, intending to examine it later. The village committee had convened again, and Miss Marple followed them at a discreet distance, noting the tension among the usual suspects. Mrs. Henshaw fidgeted with her lace cuff while presenting her suggestions for the autumn festival. Mrs. Pennington interjected repeatedly, her comments measured but sharp, betraying a defensive edge beneath her civility. Miss Pritchard listened silently, nodding in all the right places, yet her gaze flicked repeatedly toward the hall's kitchen entrance, as though anticipating some unspoken movement. It was during this session that a small, nearly imperceptible action revealed itself to Miss Marple. While Mrs. Henshaw spoke, her sleeve brushed the edge of the kitchen door frame, leaving a faint streak of flour on the varnish. The movement was so slight that no one else noticed, yet it implied presence or attention at a crucial moment. Paired with the smudge on the teacup and the hidden note, Miss Marple began to trace a subtle pattern of observation. Small details, inconsequential at first glance, but collectively meaningful. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered near the kitchen, examining the layout of the countertops and the placement of utensils. One cup, placed slightly askew, bore a faint irregular ring at its base, a stain not from tea but from something denser, darker. Miss Marple's mind ticked quietly, noting how the cup's position suggested that someone had handled it with care, perhaps deliberately shifting it after the incident. Her reflections were interrupted by a gentle voice. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you?" It was Mr. Cartwright, the vicar, approaching with a subtle urgency. His hat was held in his hands and a shadow of concern crossed his face. "Of course, Reverend," Miss Marple said, inclining her head. "I am merely reviewing yesterday's small details." He glanced toward the table and then lowered his voice. "I fear the villagers are growing anxious. They speculate wildly, and tensions rise with every passing hour. Perhaps you can calm them?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Observation, Reverend, is often more effective than words. The answers lie in what people do, not what they say." Later in the afternoon, she returned to her cottage and spread the scrap of note across her table. The ink, faint but legible, read in part, "Must not let it go. Elderberry. Careful. Only at tea." Miss Marple's fingers traced the letters. The fragment was incomplete, but the implication was clear. Someone had written instructions, or perhaps a warning related to the elderberry cake. The meaning remained elusive, yet it pointed toward deliberate action rather than accident. Her attention shifted to the villagers' earlier behaviour. Mrs. Henshaw's nervous gestures, Miss Pritchard's vigilant glances, Mrs. Pennington's guarded posture, all began to coalesce in her mind with the newly found clue. One action, one hesitation, one minor misalignment of a teacup could now be interpreted in context. In the late afternoon, Miss Marple visited Mr. Thackeray, who was recovering steadily at the vicarage. He greeted her with a polite smile, but his eyes betrayed residual tension. "I still cannot understand why someone would do such a thing," he said, pouring himself a cup of tea with careful hands. Miss Marple observed the teapot, the cup, the motion of his hands. Everything appeared deliberate and cautious, as expected after the scare. Yet, her mind returned to the scrap of paper and the subtle flour smear. It was not Mr. Thackeray's caution that concerned her. It was the human web around him, the hidden movements that went unnoticed by everyone else. That evening, as the village quieted, Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, notebook open. Her knitting lay untouched. She methodically reviewed the day's observations, the hidden note, the smudge on the teacup, the flour trace, the slight awkwardness in gestures, and the fleeting glances among the villagers. Each detail, minor on its own, now formed a pattern, and one thought emerged more clearly than any other. The incident had been neither accident nor misfortune. Someone in St. Mary Mead had watched, calculated, and acted with subtle precision. Miss Marple did not yet know the culprit, but she felt the first edges of understanding take shape. It was a detail everyone else had missed, a fragment of paper, a smear of flour, an askew teacup. To others, they were trivial. To Miss Marple, they were the first whisper of truth in a room full of polite deceit. The day ended with the village returning to its uneasy routine. Conversations were guarded, laughter tentative, and suspicion simmered beneath polite civility. Miss Marple, however, did not worry about the pace of revelation. Human behaviour, she knew, revealed all eventually. One by one, the threads would unravel, and the invisible pattern would become undeniable. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had settled into an uneasy rhythm. Windows remained slightly ajar, shutters half closed, and the familiar rustle of gossip carried through the streets like a cautious whisper. Miss Marple, knitting bag slung over her arm, walked deliberately from cottage to cottage, observing the silent choreography of the village. Every movement, every glance, every small gesture held meaning. The day's first visit was to Mrs. Henshaw, who had taken to sitting by her parlour window, watching passers-by as though each step might reveal some hidden truth. Her hands rested lightly on her knees, but her fingers tapped a nervous rhythm. "I can't help thinking," she began cautiously, "that perhaps someone wanted to frighten him, rather than harm him." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Fear is often easier to conceal than intent," she replied. "But actions sometimes betray thoughts that words never will." Mrs. Henshaw nodded, though unease lingered in her eyes. Even in her words, she hinted at knowledge she was reluctant to voice. Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her shoulders, the way her gaze flicked toward the garden gate, a subtle indication of observation or concern beyond the obvious. From there, Miss Marple wandered toward Miss Pritchard, who had taken refuge in the vicarage garden, ostensibly to enjoy the morning air. The newcomer's posture remained meticulous, every movement deliberate. "I cannot help but feel," she said softly, almost to herself, "that appearances are deceiving. One never truly knows who is observing whom." Her gaze swept the hedgerows and flower beds with a faint sharpness, lingering on corners others considered unremarkable. Miss Marple's lips lifted slightly in acknowledgement. And sometimes the smallest observations reveal what is hidden in plain sight. Later, a gathering at the village hall brought the villagers into closer contact, their restrained interactions simmering with tension. Mrs. Pennington arrived early, her carefully arranged hair and tidy gloves belying the tension in her movements. Her fingers lingered on the edge of the hall table, brushing lightly over the polished surface, then withdrawing almost imperceptibly. She exchanged polite words with Mrs. Henshaw, but her eyes darted repeatedly toward the kitchen, where the elderberry cake had once been displayed. Mr. Thackeray, meanwhile, made an effort to engage with the villagers politely, yet his cautious demeanour betrayed an awareness of scrutiny. Every gesture, from the tilt of his head to the measured placement of his cup, was deliberate. Miss Marple observed him closely, noting the subtle stiffness in his fingers, the quick glance at the teapot, and the almost imperceptible pause when speaking about the cake. It was during this gathering that small, hidden tensions began to surface. Mrs. Henshaw's casual remarks about the tea were punctuated by nervous hesitations. Miss Pritchard's polite queries were threaded with a quiet insistence on precision. Mrs. Pennington's carefully chosen words revealed a faint defensiveness that belied her calm exterior. Miss Marple observed these subtle exchanges, noting contradictions and micro-behaviours others overlooked. A smile too quick, a nod too slow, yet a gaze that lingered longer than the social convention allowed. These small inconsistencies often carried the weight of unspoken truths. By mid-morning, the vicar, Mr. Cartwright, requested Miss Marple's presence to discuss the situation privately. She found him pacing near the garden path, hands clasped behind his back. "The village is restless," he said, his tone low. "Some have begun speculating wildly about motives and intentions. I fear tensions will rise before facts are fully understood." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, "but people often reveal far more through omission than through speech. I intend to watch and listen." Her observations were quickly rewarded. During a brief break, she noticed Mrs. Henshaw adjusting a teacup, her fingers brushing against a faint smear on the saucer, perhaps overlooked, perhaps intentional. At the same moment, Miss Pritchard's eyes flicked toward the same table with a subtle calculation, pausing as if measuring the impact of her movement. Miss Marple's attention to these small overlaps suggested an intricate dance of observation and concealment, with each player unaware of how their minor gestures were being noticed. Even Mr. Thackeray became a participant in this subtle choreography. A casual remark about the elderberry cake drew a brief, almost imperceptible flinch from Mrs. Pennington. Miss Marple's gaze lingered, noting how the flinch mirrored a hesitation in Mrs. Pennington's hands, a hesitation that might have otherwise gone unnoticed. As afternoon settled into the village, Miss Marple traced patterns through streets and hedgerows. Conversations revealed the careful management of impressions, Mrs. Henshaw expressing concern yet withholding certain observations, Miss Pritchard offering neutral commentary while silently evaluating responses, Mrs. Pennington maintaining civility but betraying tension in the smallest gestures. Each small deviation from expected behaviour provided insight into the hidden relationships and potential motives simmering beneath polite exteriors. By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, knitting bag in hand, mind full of details to catalogue. The web was now becoming clearer, minor gestures, subtle flinches, and hesitant words connected across multiple villagers. Tensions that had been barely perceptible the day before were now forming recognisable patterns. The quiet, so often deceptive in St Mary Mead was thick with human calculation. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and opened her notebook. She began drawing lines connecting observations. The smear on the teacup, Mrs Henshaw's nervous gestures, Miss Pritchard's alert vigilance, Mrs Pennington's defensive attention to the kitchen. Each thread was a potential clue, seemingly minor alone but significant in combination. It was a slow unravelling, careful and deliberate, as Miss Marple had always known it would be. The villagers, polite yet tense, continued their ordinary activities unaware of how closely they were being observed. The web of human behaviour, suspicion, and secrecy was quietly exposing itself, strand by strand. As dusk approached, a sense of inevitability settled over Miss Marple. The initial panic of the harvest tea had passed, but the underlying tensions remained. Secrets, grudges, and careful calculations, each contributing to the fragile social equilibrium, were beginning to surface. And Miss Marple, patient as ever, waited for the subtle signals that would ultimately reveal which strand concealed the true motive. The morning air in St Mary Mead had a crispness that suggested autumn was no longer far off. Leaves whispered along the village green, and shutters creaked faintly in the gentle breeze. For the villagers, yesterday's events were still fresh in memory, yet the conversation now carried a new undercurrent, an awareness that the incident might not have been isolated. Miss Marple, as usual, took her early walk, moving through quiet streets with careful observation. Villagers greeted her with polite nods, though their expressions bore a trace of lingering unease. Every glance, every posture, every hesitant gesture held meaning. In her mind, she was already tracing the lines between yesterday's events, the subtle interactions of villagers, and the hidden tensions that simmered beneath civility. Her attention first fell on Mrs Pennington, who was checking her windows as if to ensure that nothing had been disturbed in the night. Her gloved fingers lingered on the latch longer than necessary, a faint crease of worry between her brows. Miss Marple noted it, filing the gesture alongside yesterday's defensive mannerisms and flinches. By mid-morning, news arrived that heightened the villagers' unease. A parcel intended for Mr Thackeray had been discovered, unopened but suspicious. The outer wrapping was neat, sealed carefully, yet the contents were unknown, and a faint scent of almonds, bitter and clinging, drifted from the paper. The villagers quickly speculated. Was it another attempt at harm, or merely a harmless gift gone awry? Miss Marple observed the reactions closely. Mrs Henshaw froze mid-step when the parcel was mentioned, her eyes widening just slightly before she lowered her gaze. Miss Pritchard leaned against a wall, her hands clasped, scanning the gathering with an almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. Even Mrs Pennington, who had insisted on the safety of her baking, now displayed a small, fleeting tremor in her fingers. Constable Peters, flustered by the development, suggested opening the parcel immediately, but Miss Marple advised patience. Observation first, action later, she said quietly. The reactions it evokes may be as revealing as the contents themselves. The parcel was carried to Mr Thackeray's cottage, where he stood waiting, Dorset's hands folded in front of him. He glanced at Miss Marple with a mix of relief and apprehension. "I cannot imagine anyone wishing me ill a second time," he said, carefully placing the parcel on the table. His voice was calm, but the subtle tension in his posture betrayed a nervous awareness. Miss Marple watched the villagers gather at a respectful distance. Each movement was deliberate, each glance measured. "Watch," she murmured softly to herself. "The truth is often revealed in instinct, not words." As the wrapping was removed, a small vial tumbled into view, its contents a faintly coloured liquid. The villagers gasped, some stepping back instinctively. A faint aroma of almonds, the signature of certain toxic substances, wafted through the room. Mr Thackeray, though pale, remained composed as if expecting this escalation. Immediate accusations began to swirl. Mrs Henshaw's hands flew to her mouth, though no words emerged. Miss Pritchard's brow furrowed, her gaze scanning the room for reactions, calculating who might have had the opportunity to send such a thing. Mrs Pennington's defences rose automatically, her voice measured but tight as she insisted. "I would never. Of course, it must be someone else entirely." Miss Marple, however, remained quiet, noting the subtle betrayals in behaviour. Mrs. Henshaw's hesitation to meet anyone's eyes, Miss Pritchard's quick glance toward the back entrance, Mrs. Pennington's slight tension in her shoulders. Each reaction, minute as it was, hinted at the hidden relationships between the villagers and the potential for deceit. She also noticed something smaller, almost trivial yet significant: the positioning of the parcel. It had been placed with care on the table, yet a faint smudge at its base suggested it had been moved after delivery. The angle of the wrap, the imprint of fingers, the residue of wax, all pointed to deliberate handling. Miss Marple filed the detail quietly, adding it to the growing tapestry of observation that no one else seemed to perceive. Later, in the quiet of the vicarage garden, Miss Marple spoke privately with Mr. Cartwright. "The parcel is a message, not merely a gift," she said softly. "It is designed to provoke, to unsettle. But notice the reactions, the hesitation, the subtle movements. They tell a story the words will not reveal." The vicar nodded thoughtfully. "And you believe it is connected to the earlier incident?" "Certainly," Miss Marple replied. "Someone is testing the waters, measuring responses. That is often the prelude to action, or the cover for one already taken." As the day waned, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, knitting bag in hand but mind active. She catalogued each observation: Mrs. Henshaw's nervous restraint, Miss Pritchard's measured vigilance, Mrs. Pennington's defensive posturing, Mr. Thackeray's composed yet wary presence. And the parcel, a new puzzle, had shifted suspicion in subtle, revealing ways. The villagers, anxious and speculative, attempted to assign blame, yet Miss Marple's patience allowed her to observe the small divergences, tiny betrayals in posture, fleeting glances, slight misalignments of hands and objects. In her mind, the web of human behaviour grew increasingly intricate, and the patterns began to form with quiet inevitability. By evening, shadows stretched long across the village green, and Miss Marple sat in her chair by the window, notebook open. She traced lines connecting yesterday's incident with today's parcel. Gestures, smudges, hidden notes, and hesitant words. Each seemingly minor detail now formed part of an invisible map of intent, a social web only she could discern in its entirety. A second suspicious event, subtle yet significant, had shifted the balance. The first incident had been sudden, dramatic. This one was quiet, measured, and deliberate. The villagers whispered among themselves, fearful and curious, yet Miss Marple alone understood the importance of what had gone unnoticed. The reactions, the hesitations, and the precise placement of the parcel, all clues that would, in time, lead to the unravelling of truth. The stage, she realised, was now set for deeper revelations. The threads were numerous, overlapping and deliberate, and among them, the true culprit waited, unaware that Miss Marple had already begun to trace the pattern to its origin. The morning dawned grey, and still over St. Mary Mead, a faint mist curling along the edges of hedgerows and the village green. Miss Marple stepped from her cottage with quiet deliberation, knitting bag slung lightly across her arm. After the parcel incident, the village had grown tense, a careful tension that masked more than it revealed. Miss Marple understood that the next phase required patience, not action, not accusation, but observation. Her first visit was to Mrs. Pennington, who was arranging flowers in her kitchen window with meticulous care. Her hands moved deftly, but there was a subtle tightness in her shoulders. A slight tremor when she lifted a vase. Miss Marple remarked lightly, "Your roses are particularly resilient this year." Mrs. Pennington straightened, offering a polite smile, yet her fingers lingered on the vase just a second too long. "Yes, well, one must pay attention," she replied. "Resilience is useful, isn't it?" Miss Marple inclined her head, noting the phrasing. "Indeed. Attention often reveals things unnoticed by others," she said softly, allowing the remark to linger. She did not push further. The remark was a gentle prod, not a confrontation, designed to elicit subtle responses. Next, she wandered toward Miss Pritchard, who had taken to pacing in the vicarage garden, eyes alert to every movement. Miss Marple greeted her lightly, commenting on the neatness of the hedgerows. Miss Pritchard's reply was precise, measured, yet her fingers brushed the gate twice as if confirming its sturdiness. A fleeting tightening of the jaw caught Miss Marple's attention, a slight sign of vigilance, perhaps anticipation of scrutiny. By mid-morning, Miss Marple returned to Mr. Thackeray, who had spent the night reflecting on the parcel. She arrived just as he poured a cup of tea, hands steady yet deliberate. "Curious, isn't it," she said, "how something so small can create such ripples?" Mr. Thackeray smiled faintly, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. "Indeed, a small act can reveal much about character," he said, "or conceal it." Miss Marple made no reply, allowing the words to hang. The subtle exchange was part of her design, to measure reactions, to note hesitation or overcompensation, and to observe what each individual considered worth revealing or hiding. Later, at the village hall, the psychological test became more evident. Miss Marple arranged for a small demonstration of the remaining elderberry cake to be placed in plain view. She invited the usual suspects, Mrs. Henshaw, Mrs. Pennington, Miss Pritchard, and Mr. Thackeray, to a casual tea, framing it as a gesture of communal reassurance. As the group gathered, she remarked lightly, "It is remarkable how certain flavours linger in memory. One might not even notice a change, unless carefully attentive." Her gaze lingered on the cake, then shifted briefly to each villager. The reactions were subtle but telling. Mrs. Henshaw's hands twitched toward the edge of the table, then retracted. Miss Pritchard's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, measuring each movement. Mrs. Pennington adjusted her gloves, as if to smooth away an invisible stain of anxiety. Mr. Thackeray's fingers clasped more tightly around his cup, though his expression remained composed. Miss Marple's lips lifted in a slight smile. None of them spoke, yet their reactions confirmed her suspicions. Observation, not accusation, revealed truth. The psychological trap was working. Each villager had revealed more than they intended through instinctive gestures, micro-expressions and subtle hesitations. After tea, Miss Marple lingered quietly, observing interactions among the villagers. Small conversations betrayed careful calibrations, a phrase slightly overemphasized, a glance too quick to meet another's eyes, a gesture of nervous attention. Patterns began to emerge. Mrs. Henshaw's frequent glances at the cake, Miss Pritchard's measured monitoring of movements, Pennington's defensive body language, and Mr. Thackeray's controlled tension, all fit into a web that only Miss Marple could discern in full. Later in the afternoon, Miss Marple took a brief walk along the village green, reflecting on her observations. She reviewed the subtle clues she had collected: the flower smudge, the faint inked note, the teacup stain, and now these instinctive behavioural signals. Each clue alone was unremarkable. Together they formed a coherent pattern pointing toward human calculation rather than accident. Returning home, she opened her notebook and began cataloguing the day's findings. Small sketches of positions, lines connecting subtle gestures, and notes on reactions began to map the invisible social web. She marked the times when hands twitched, eyes flickered, or words were repeated unnecessarily. The puzzle was taking shape, quietly, deliberately. By evening, the village seemed outwardly calm, though tension simmered beneath the surface. Miss Marple, sitting by her window, knitting idle stitches, contemplated the pattern. The psychological trap had yielded responses, hints of guilt, signs of careful concealment, and instinctive reactions that betrayed hidden knowledge. And she knew, with the quiet certainty of experience, that the threads would soon lead to more concrete revelations. The villagers, polite and careful, were now revealing themselves in ways they did not intend. In this delicate dance of observation and reaction, Miss Marple had begun to set the stage for the uncovering of truth. The following morning, St. Mary Mead seemed smaller, quieter, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Shadows lingered longer along the streets, and every clatter or murmur drew glances sharper than usual. Miss Marple moved through the village with her usual calm, keen eyes, noting the subtle signals that others overlooked, a hand brushing against a fence too deliberately, a glance flickering toward a window, a foot tapping ever so slightly beneath a table. Her first stop was the home of Mrs. Henshaw, who had been pacing in her parlour since dawn. When Miss Marple entered, the woman offered a faint, nervous smile. I hardly slept," she admitted. "The parcel, the cake, it all seemed so impossible." She wrung a handkerchief between her fingers brushing a tiny crease that revealed tension. Miss Marple nodded. "The fear is natural. But it is what people do under fear or anticipation that reveals more than words. She let her gaze rest lightly on Mrs. Henshaw, noting how the woman's shoulders tensed when her eyes lingered on the teacup at the corner of the table. From there, Miss Marple ventured to the vicarage garden, where Miss Pritchard had been arranging plants with meticulous care. She straightened as Miss Marple approached, hands clasped behind her back. "Good morning," she said, her voice precise yet layered with subtle unease. "The village is restless." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied softly. "Restlessness often brings hidden truths to the surface. People behave in ways they cannot always control." Miss Pritchard's eyes flicked toward a shadowed corner of the garden, and her jaw tightened fractionally. Miss Marple made a note of it. Subtle vigilance, the instinctive measurement of an unseen presence. By mid-morning, a small gathering at the village hall brought several villagers together under polite pretences. Mrs. Pennington had arrived early, her hands folded yet trembling slightly, glancing repeatedly toward the kitchen. Mr. Thackeray, cautious yet composed, sat with measured posture, his gaze darting only occasionally. The conversation, though ostensibly about the upcoming autumn festival, quickly revealed fissures beneath the social surface. Mrs. Henshaw, attempting to appear helpful, over-explained simple points, giving away more information than necessary. Miss Pritchard offered measured, deliberate corrections, hinting at knowledge of earlier events without directly revealing it. Mrs. Pennington's commentary veered toward defensive explanations, revealing subtle worry over her role in the cake incident. Miss Marple observed all with her customary patience, noting micro-behaviours, a twitch of a hand, a delayed response, a glance that lingered too long. These small details, unnoticed by others, were rich with meaning. A sudden minor incident drew the villagers' attention. A teacup slid slightly from the edge of the table, catching Mrs. Pennington's fingers just in time. Her startled gasp, though polite in tone, betrayed real alarm. Miss Marple's gaze traced the movement and noted the smudge along the base of the cup, faint but deliberate. The moment sparked a flurry of polite concern and commentary, yet in the subtle exchanges that followed, truths began to emerge. Mrs. Henshaw's hands brushed against her skirt nervously, as if avoiding mention of her proximity to the cake the day before. Miss Pritchard's eyes darted toward the kitchen, a micro-expression betraying her knowledge of hidden actions. Mr. Thackeray remained poised, yet his fingers fidgeted briefly with a napkin, betraying unease beneath calm composure. Later, Miss Marple spoke quietly with Mr. Cartwright, observing the dynamics from a distance. "It is remarkable," she said softly, "how fear, anticipation, and social propriety intermingle. People reveal more than they intend and conceal less than they believe." The vicar nodded. "Indeed, yet it is a delicate balance. Any overt probing risks panic, while patience allows truth to surface naturally." By afternoon, Miss Marple had traced subtle connections between yesterday's parcel, the minor incidents during tea, and today's nervous behaviours. The pattern was emerging. Each individual displayed hesitation, micro-expressions and gestures revealing awareness of actions they preferred to conceal. A brief conversation between Mrs. Henshaw and Mrs. Pennington highlighted these hidden tensions further. "I only meant to help," Mrs. Henshaw said, voice low, eyes averted. Mrs. Pennington's lips tightened. "Of course, my dear, but help sometimes has unintended consequences." Her gaze flicked briefly toward the tea table, then away, as if avoiding acknowledgement of the cake's significance. Miss Marple, observing quietly, noted the exchange. Layered meaning beneath polite words, tensions revealed in posture, gaze, and inflection. These minor confrontations, subtle and understated, were far more revealing than dramatic outbursts could ever be. As the day waned, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, notebook in hand. She catalogued gestures, fleeting expressions, and observed inconsistencies in behaviour. Mrs. Henshaw's nervous attentiveness, Miss Pritchard's precise vigilance, Mrs. Pennington's subtle defensiveness, and Mr. Thackeray's measured tension all pointed to a complex web of hidden interactions and unspoken awareness. Even as the villagers retired for the evening, polite and composed outwardly, Miss Marple reflected on the day's subtle confrontations. The social web was unravelling, revealing grudges, hidden knowledge, and instincts that none of the villagers had consciously acknowledged. Every slip, hesitation, or glance contributed to a map of human behaviour that Miss Marple alone could interpret fully. The village seemed calm, but beneath the surface, the threads of suspicion, fear, and concealed motives intertwined. Miss Marple, seated by her window, knitting bag untouched, understood that the next phase would bring the final clarity, a connection between actions, gestures, and the hidden intent behind the incidents. And when the time came, the unravelling of human behaviour would reveal the truth entirely. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke under a pale morning sun, the streets unusually quiet. Though life continued its routine, a subtle tension lingered like fog over the green. After the parcel incident, villagers were cautious, polite, yet visibly wary of one another. Miss Marple, walking her usual route, observed everything: the shuffle of feet, the half-turn of heads, the quick glance toward windows and doorways. Her first stop was Mrs. Henshaw, who was arranging flowers by the window. She smiled nervously as Miss Marple entered, hands slightly trembling over the vase. I thought I might tidy things before anyone arrived," she murmured. Miss Marple noted the carefulness of her movements, the pause before arranging a bloom. Small gestures could be revealing, even when words were constrained by propriety. By mid-morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village hall, where an unusual commotion had drawn a crowd. The tea trolley had been left for the committee's inspection, and a small tray of leftover slices was discovered with one missing piece. Though minor, the absence immediately sparked speculation. Had someone been at the hall during the night, or had the slice been moved deliberately to send a message? Constable Peters inspected the hall but could find no sign of forced entry, yet villagers whispered urgently. "Perhaps someone wishes to unsettle us further," Mrs. Pennington said, voice tight. Miss Marple noticed the subtle tremor in her hands, the brief, fleeting glance toward the kitchen corner, as though reluctant to acknowledge the implication. Miss Marple moved through the room carefully, noting tiny signs overlooked by the rest. A faint smear on the edge of a saucer, a light indentation in the tablecloth where someone had rested their hand, and a faint scent lingering in the air. Not tea, not sugar, but something subtle and bitter. The combination of details suggested careful, deliberate placement, not accident. Across the hall, Miss Pritchard appeared unusually alert. Her eyes scanned the room in calculated sweeps, pausing briefly over each familiar object. When she noticed Miss Marple observing, she offered a faint, controlled smile. Yet her fingers drummed lightly on the tabletop, betraying tension. Miss Marple noted this silently. Every micro-expression, every instinctive reaction was another clue. The second incident, though minor in scale, had a profound effect on the village. Mrs. Henshaw, attempting calm, spoke hurriedly. "It's only a leftover piece, surely, but—" Her words faltered, and her gaze darted to the corner of the hall where the teacups rested. A subtle gesture, unnoticed by others, suggested prior presence near the display, a small, telling signal. Even Mr. Thackeray reacted, though outwardly composed. He straightened, eyes narrowing ever so slightly as he examined the tray. His hands, steady yet tense, indicated unease beneath his polite exterior. Miss Marple observed his posture, noting the faint line of worry around his mouth and the rapid blink that followed. Later, a private conversation with Mr. Cartwright reinforced Miss Marple's suspicions. "The villagers are frightened," the vicar said. "They are polite, yet every glance carries caution. It is as though even minor movements are weighed for significance." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and it is precisely in these measured reactions that truth often emerges. Small gestures, hesitation, instinct. These are the indicators that words cannot fully conceal." Miss Marple then orchestrated a subtle test of her own. She requested a small tea gathering, ostensibly to review the committee's preparations for the autumn festival. She invited Mrs. Henshaw, Mrs. Pennington, Miss Pritchard, and Mr. Thackeray. The remaining slices of elderberry cake were placed in plain view, arranged deliberately so that everyone could see them. "Curious, isn't it?" Miss Marple said lightly. "How small acts can create ripples. Even a single slice seems capable of drawing attention." Her gaze travelled slowly across the group, noting reactions without comment. The results were subtle but illuminating. Mrs. Henshaw's hands twitched toward the tray before retracting. Miss Pritchard's eyes flicked toward the back door, scanning almost instinctively. Mrs. Pennington adjusted her gloves and took a careful step back, and Mr. Thackeray's fingers tightened around his cup, the faintest line of tension appearing on his brow. Miss Marple observed silently. None of the villagers spoke, yet their reactions betrayed awareness, unease, or concealed knowledge. The second incident had acted as a psychological probe, revealing instincts that words could not convey. Later, Miss Marple catalogued each observation in her notebook. The faint teacup smear, the missing slice, the subtle tremors of fingers, the careful monitoring of others, each detail formed a pattern. The web of hidden motives and unspoken knowledge was slowly being mapped in her mind. As dusk approached, Miss Marple returned to her cottage. She seated herself by the window, notebook open, fingers resting lightly on her knitting. The second incident had not caused harm, yet it had clarified behaviour and instincts. The subtle reactions, so easily overlooked by others, pointed to connections between villagers, small acts of observation, and careful concealment. The village may have seemed calm on the surface, but beneath the polite exteriors, tension was now layered and revealing. Miss Marple understood the value of the second incident. It was a test, deliberate or accidental, but it provided insight into human behaviour and motive. She reflected on the day's events: Mrs. Henshaw's nervous attentiveness, Miss Pritchard's precise vigilance, Mrs. Pennington's defensive gestures, Mr. Thackeray's composed yet tense demeanour, and the subtle indications from the hall itself: the missing slice, the teacup smudge, and the faint scent lingering in the air. Each piece, small and easily dismissed, was part of a broader pattern she was beginning to discern. And with this understanding, Miss Marple knew the next phase would demand patience, precision, and careful orchestration. The hidden truths were beginning to emerge, and soon, the web of deception and human calculation would reveal the culprit entirely. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet that morning, as though the very air sensed the gathering storm of understanding about to break. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting idle stitches, notebook open, each page filled with careful observations, small notes, and tentative connections. For days she had traced gestures, micro-expressions, hesitations, and subtle inconsistencies. The puzzle pieces were now complete, and only the final act remained. Her plan was simple, elegant, and, as always, patient. She invited the usual suspects, Mrs. Henshaw, Mrs. Pennington, Miss Pritchard, and Mr. Thackeray, to the village hall, framing it as a casual meeting to finalise the arrangements for the upcoming autumn festival. The hall was set with a single table, down upon which she had placed a fresh slice of elderberry cake, untouched but prominently displayed. It was more than a cake. It was a stage for observation, a tool to provoke instinctive responses. The villagers arrived in order, polite but tense. Mrs. Henshaw's hands fidgeted with her lace cuff. Miss Pritchard's posture was precise and alert. Mrs. Pennington's gloves were adjusted meticulously, and Mr. Thackeray's fingers rested lightly on his cup, controlled yet slightly taut. Miss Marple observed each silently, noting the microsignals, the way a gaze lingered, a hand twitched, a lip pressed just so. Once everyone was seated, Miss Marple began her careful questioning, her voice soft, almost casual. "It is curious, isn't it," she said, "how a small thing like a slice of cake can draw attention, reveal patterns, and yet remain unnoticed by most." Her eyes flicked to the elderberry slice and then slowly to each person at the table. Mrs. Henshaw's fingers twitched toward the cake and retracted. Miss Pritchard's eyes flicked briefly toward the kitchen entrance. Mrs. Pennington adjusted her gloves subtly but deliberately, as if correcting a hidden nervous tic. Mr. Thackeray's fingers clenched slightly around his cup. People respond in instinctive ways, sometimes revealing far more than they intend, Miss Marple continued. Little smudges, misplaced items, hesitant movements, they are all statements, gestures, clues. She allowed her words to hang in the air, letting each person reflect, subtly probe themselves, and react they did. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Henshaw began, voice shaky, I only wanted to help. I don't understand how any of this, how anyone could." Her hands fluttered over the table nervously, betraying a small anxiety. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "Indeed, you acted with good intentions. Yet, instinctive behaviour can reveal truths even when words conceal them. Let us examine the events carefully, shall we?" Miss Marple traced the sequence aloud, calmly, without accusation, allowing each piece to fall into place. She began with the harvest tea, noting the subtle inconsistencies, the placement of teacups, the faint smudges, Mrs. Henshaw's nervous proximity, and Mr. Thackeray's reactions. She spoke of the parcel, the missing cake slice, and the faint trace of bitter almonds, tying each detail logically, chronologically, and psychologically. The villagers listened, tense but attentive. Miss Pritchard shifted slightly, a faint tightening of the jaw, while Mrs. Pennington's gloved hands rested tensely over the tablecloth. Mr. Thackeray remained calm but alert, tracking each observation with careful awareness. "And now," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "let us consider the hidden note, the fragment tucked beneath the teacup. It was small, almost unnoticed, yet its message was clear. Someone had intended to interfere with the cake deliberately. Someone had observed, waited, and acted with precision. A pause, measured, allowed the significance to settle. Miss Marple's eyes moved deliberately around the table, resting finally on Mrs. Pennington. She spoke softly, almost conversationally. Curious how careful one must be when preparing something for others. One slice, slightly altered, can create panic, suspicion, and fear if handled with knowledge of human behaviour, and knowledge, of course, implies observation. Mrs. Pennington, who among us observed the cake and the guests more closely than anyone else? Mrs. Pennington's composure faltered for a fraction of a second. Her gloved fingers twitched, her gaze dropped to the table, and her lips pressed tightly together. The slightest, almost imperceptible shift, a micro-expression unnoticed by anyone else, betrayed awareness of actions beyond normal preparation. Miss Marple continued, calmly and without drama. The flour smudge, the teacup residue, the careful handling of utensils, the nervous glance at the missing slice, all point to someone who monitored reactions, who sought to manipulate perception rather than act in panic. Mrs. Pennington, it was your meticulous attention and knowledge of the villagers' behaviour that inadvertently revealed the intent behind the incidents. The room was silent. Mrs. Pennington's hands, trembling slightly, rested over the edge of the table. I did not," she began, voice faltering, but Miss Marple gently interrupted. "Intent was present, Mrs. Pennington. You meant no real harm, yet the effect was undeniable. A psychological play executed with precision to elicit panic. All the evidence, the flour, the hidden note, the teacup smudge, and the parcel, points unmistakably to you. Your careful observation, your defensive gestures, and the subtle reactions you induced all form the pattern." Tears welled in Mrs. Pennington's eyes, and she nodded slowly. "I only wanted to frighten him, to prevent him from revealing my family's financial troubles. I did not intend serious harm. It was only a warning." Miss Marple inclined her head, expression gentle. Warnings can have consequences, and human nature interprets them in unpredictable ways. The incidents have caused fear, yet no permanent harm came to anyone, though lessons have been learned. Mrs. Henshaw exhaled, relief washing over her. Miss Pritchard's tension eased, and even Mr. Thackeray allowed a faint, controlled smile. Miss Marple turned to Mr. Cartwright, who had observed quietly from the side. "Everything is accounted for. Each gesture, hesitation, and subtle act has been interpreted, each reaction understood. There are no loose ends." She summarised methodically. The cake incident, the parcel, the hidden note, the missing slice, all were part of a single chain of subtle psychological manipulation, and each villager's reactions had provided the final confirmations. Every inconsistency was resolved, every hidden motive disclosed. The village breathed, collectively, with a quiet sense of closure. There was no drama, no public accusation, only understanding and subtle acknowledgement. Miss Marple had untangled the human web, exposing truth with patience, observation, and insight. Even as the villagers departed the hall that evening, a hushed reflection lingered in the air. Polite conversation resumed, yet beneath it lay a quiet respect for the detective who had revealed the invisible pattern, resolved the fears, and allowed the community to retain its dignity. Miss Marple returned home, her knitting bag once again in hand. She reflected on human nature, its complexity, its foibles, and its predictability when observed carefully. Even in the calm aftermath, she understood that vigilance, perception, and patience were the tools that revealed truth. The village would move forward, the incident becoming a story to tell, a lesson in observation and restraint. The final confirmation arrived in the form of a written statement, Mrs. Pennington, though remorseful, provided a detailed account of her actions, corroborating every subtle observation Miss Marple had recorded. The note, the parcel, the flower smudge, all were accounted for, ensuring that justice and understanding aligned. And in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple smiled faintly, resuming her knitting. The mysteries were complete. Every gesture, every hidden thought, every subtle act had found its place in the pattern. Nothing remained unresolved. In St. Mary Mead the autumn air was still, but beneath its calm the lessons of vigilance, human nature, and observation endured. Peace had returned, quietly and completely, leaving behind only the faintest trace of unease, a reminder that, while truth could be revealed, human folly was eternal.